Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Rachel Gilkey. I'm Director of Programming and Education here at Irish Arts Center. I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight, the day after St. Patrick's Day. Thank you for coming to another Irish event. Tonight we are proud to present author Terrry Golway, whose recent book, Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics, presents another side of New York City's early 20th century political powerhouse. A Tammany that operated as a force for good alongside the more corrupt political force that is the Tammany that likely comes to mind. This side of Tammany sought to give immigrants equal footing in New York City, responded progressively to events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and created the groundwork for politics in New York City as well as nationwide today. Terry is a journalist for 30 years, writing for the New York Observer, the New York Times, and other venues. He's the author of many articles and books, including Irish Rebel, John Devoy and America's Fight for Irish Freedom, and For the Cause of Liberty, 1,000 Years of Ireland's Heroes. He holds a PhD in American History from Rutgers University and is currently the director of the Kean University Center for History, Politics, and Policy in New Jersey. Terry is joined on stage by the incomparable triumvirate of Aideen Maloney, Sean Gormley, and John Keating to my left, who will bring to life the voices of politicians, social workers, and the anonymous immigrants during the era of Tammany Hall. We are always pleased when Irish Arts Center has the opportunity to invite such fine actors as Aideen, Sean, and John to our stage. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you. There will be a question and answer period from the audience toward the end of the evening. We'll have a microphone to pass around. And we hope you'll stick around after the show. Be sure to take a look and hopefully purchase Machine Made out in our gallery. And Terry will be there to sign and answer any questions. You may have seen an article about our new building in the New York Times yesterday. And if you haven't, thank you. If you haven't, I believe there are articles outside to pick up. But I just want to remind you that the reason we are building a new building is so that we can create evenings like tonight for writers and performers like Terry, John, Aideen, and Sean, for all of the musicians, for playwrights, all of the artists that are a part of the New York City and the Irish artist community, and for connecting with and creating relationships with audiences like you. So I thank you very much for joining us this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Terry to the stage.
Thank you, Rachel. And thanks to all of you, and thanks to our actors. Yes, I do have bubonic plague. That is the reason for my questionable voice. I'm sorry about that. If I seemed ruder than usual to most of you as you were coming in, it's because I didn't want you too to get bubonic plague. But thank you. We're here today to talk about a history that isn't as well known as it should be, I think. But luckily, thanks to the inspiration of the man I dedicated the book to, Peter Quinn, I've learned quite a bit about Tammany Hall over the last few years and would like to share some of that story with you tonight. Most of us, I think it would be fair to say, have heard of Tammany Hall. Some even know that Tammany Hall was an actual building, and there it is. Some may know that Tammany Hall was, in essence, the Democratic Party in Manhattan until about 1960. And if you live near Union Square, or you pay a visit there from time to time, you may know that Tammany Hall, the building, still exists. It was declared an official city landmark just a few months ago. Regardless of whether you know these details or not, you probably understand the big idea of Tammany. Right? We know that Tammany is a symbol of corrupt politics from a bygone age. We know that Tammany stole elections, shook down contractors, intimidated opponents, and yes, even shut down access lanes to the George Washington Bridge. Sorry, actually, I meant to say that Tammany helped build the George Washington Bridge, and they did it in exactly 4 years, which, as the great Daniel Patrick Moynihan often pointed out, was 8 months ahead of schedule and $15 million under budget. That was my Pat Moynihan imitation, for those of you who didn't know. So anyway, it's fair to say that history has not been kind to Tammany Hall politicians and those who voted for Tammany Hall, particularly the Irish.
Tammany Hall is not only un-American in its methods, but it is distinctly un-American in its ideals, because it represents the broad distinction between what may be called Anglo-Saxon ideals of character and public service, and the Celtic ideals of character and public service.
That was from a New York journal called The Outlook. And then there's this.
Shall the dregs of foreign filth, refuse of contents, scullions from Austrian monasteries, be permitted to dictate what Tammany must do?
That was Walt Whitman, the poet of the common man, discussing Tammany's voters. And let's not forget what they were saying about Tammany and the Irish in other places.
The Irishman uses his vote as a shillelagh. His fatal influence threatens with ruin every Anglo-Saxon polity and Anglo-Saxon civilization throughout the world.
So wrote a reporter in the British journal, The 19th Century. Tammany's reputation for brass-knuckle politics was so widespread that the organization even made a cameo appearance on the floor of the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, during the passionate debate over the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. Michael Collins attacked his former comrades at one point for their tactics in opposition to the treaty.
We will have no Tammany Hall methods here. Whether you're for the treaty or whether you're against it, fight without Tammany Hall methods.
Which led Harry Boland, who opposed the treaty and who had just returned to Dublin from New York, to reply.
I don't know anything about Tammany Hall except this, that if Minister Collins had a little training in Tammany Hall and reserved some of his bullying for Lloyd George, we would not be in the position we're in today.
Those were, regrettably, fighting words. So that's one view of Tammany Hall, a very familiar view. But there's another side to this legendary political organization. It's a side that historians and journalists generally have ignored, although some pretty prominent voices have offered testimonials to Tammany's work on behalf of immigrants, the poor, the alienated, and the despised. Frances Perkins was a high-minded social worker in the early 20th century, a reformer from New England who was new to the politics of New York when she arrived here in 1910. To her surprise, and to the shock of her colleagues, she found much to like about Tammany figures like Big Tim Sullivan, the McManus, and of course, Al Smith.
If I had been a man serving in the Senate with them, I'm sure I would have had a glass of beer with them and gotten them to tell me what times were like on the old Bowery.
As Perkins worked with Tammany politicians to achieve dramatic social change in the second decade of the 20th century, she realized that some of her colleagues in the reform movement had it wrong about the nation's most infamous political machine.
Once, when I worked in a settlement house, a woman came to ask for help after her son was arrested. The son was the sole support of the family, and if he went to prison, the woman and her young daughter would have no means of support. My colleagues in the settlement house decided the mother was not worthy of help. I was aghast. I walked over to the headquarters of the McManus Political Club, which was the Tammany clubhouse in the area. I asked to see Senator McManus. I told him about the case. The senator told me to come back at the same time the following day. I did, as he requested. The senator told me that the boy had been released. I don't know how he did it. I'm sure it was irregular. I once told my colleagues when I was younger that if I had the right to vote, I would be a Democrat. They were shocked. One of them said, "Well, look at the scum of the earth they have."
Frances Perkins went on to work with Tammany politicians, most famously Al Smith, in the years to come. And in 1933, she became Franklin Roosevelt's labor secretary, the first woman cabinet officer in American history. Here's another view of Tammany that you don't often hear. On July 4th, 1937, at the annual Independence Day commemoration at Tammany Hall, one of the machine's greatest members, Senator Robert Wagner, had this to say about the machine's place